Usually when we talk about making a bad decision, there's this expectation of a clear alternative, like a fork in the road. You take the left path, you get a flat tire, and you just point back and say, well, I should have gone right. Simple. It's a comforting binary. We like to think of our lives in those terms because it makes our regrets visible. We can categorize them as these simple, fixable errors. If X, then Y. But then you step into the world of human psychology, specifically when a mind is grappling with severe depression, and suddenly that map is broken. We're looking at a landscape of choices that is honestly murky. And if you're listening to this right now, and you've ever laid awake at 3 a.m., agonizing over a breakup that happened 5 years ago, or a career shift you didn't make, you've basically built your own miniature version of what we're exploring today. We are looking at Matt Haig's runaway bestseller, The Midnight Library. It's a massive book, but what we're doing today is peeling back the sci-fi veneer of this novel and looking at the actual machinery underneath, because this isn't just some fun hypothetical time travel romp. Today's framework treats this as a highly specific, deeply structured exploration of what happens when the human mind turns against itself. The hook of this book is undeniable. It asks a question that feels universally tempting. What if the worst night of your life was actually a door, not a metaphor for personal growth, a literal door opening into every single version of yourself that you never became? The Olympic athlete, the glaciologist, the person who said yes to Noah at 22, the person who never left, the person who never stayed. It's an incredibly seductive premise. But to understand why this book resonates the way it does, we have to look at the context behind this premise, because Matt Haig didn't write this from a comfortable, detached distance. In his late 20s, Haig suffered a complete, devastating psychological breakdown. He became profoundly agoraphobic. He genuinely did not know if he wanted to be alive. He documented that harrowing experience in his memoir, Reasons to Stay Alive. So when he writes a character who attempts suicide and ends up in this liminal space between life and death, agonizing over whether her life had any worth, that is not a clever plot device. That is a man working through his own profound trauma, which raises an interesting question about genre. If this story is born from such raw, real trauma, does putting it in a sci-fi multiverse setting cheapen the experience? Or does it act like a Trojan horse, sneaking these incredibly heavy emotional truths past our defenses so we can actually look at them without looking away? The research argues it is undeniably a Trojan horse. If you hand someone a clinical textbook on the cognitive distortions of severe depression, they're putting it down immediately. But if you tell them a story about a magical library where you can try on alternate lives like coats, they're in. The Midnight Library isn't really a story about multiverse travel at all. It's a localized internal story about what happens in the mind when you become convinced that literally any other version of your life would be better than the one you're actually living. To understand how that works, we have to look at the protagonist's starting point, her root life, as the book calls it. So, Nora Seed, 35 years old, living in Bedford, England, and over the course of just a few days, absolutely everything collapses. It is a staggering cascade of misfortune. Her cat Volts dies. She gets fired from her job at a music shop called String Theory by her boss Neil, who doesn't just fire her, he dismantles her dignity. He points out she has a philosophy degree, tells her she's made for better things, and then fires her because, in his words, he can't pay her to put off customers with a face looking like a wet weekend. Cruel. And it feeds perfectly into the narrative she's already constructing about herself. It doesn't stop there. She runs into Ravi, her brother Joe's best friend, and learns she alienated Joe years ago by backing out of their band, The Labyrinths, right when they landed a major record deal with Universal. Ravi tells her that her problem isn't stage fright, it's life fright. Heavy thing to hear. On top of that, she recently backed out of her wedding with her fiancé Dan 2 days before the ceremony. Even her smaller, more mundane connections to the world are severed. She misses a piano lesson with a young student named Leo. Her elderly neighbor, Mr. Banerjee, no longer needs her to pick up his medication. She is completely isolated. Sitting alone in her dilapidated flat, she writes a note that says, I make life worse for people. I have nothing to give. Total breaking point. But here's where we have to shift perspective. If we look closely at Nora's root life, her regrets aren't random. They have a distinct, unified shape. The story she tells herself over and over is that she is a burden. And here's the crucial insight. That story is fundamentally wrong, not because she made brilliant choices. She made messy ones, but because she is reading her life through a completely broken apparatus. Think of depression not as a mood, but as a lens, or better yet, think of it as an autoimmune disease of the memory. A healthy immune system attacks foreign threats and preserves the body. In an autoimmune disease, the body gets confused and attacks its own healthy tissue. When a person is deeply depressed, their cognitive filtering system does something similar. The mind mistakenly attacks positive memories, minimizing or erasing them entirely, while meticulously preserving and magnifying every failure, every slight, every moment of guilt. The brain actively works to convince the host that they are the toxic element in the ecosystem. So what does this mean for Nora? It means she isn't necessarily making objectively terrible choices. She is simply incapable of seeing the context of her own life clearly. The lens is too distorted. If she looks at her brother Joe, her depressed mind automatically highlights the pain she caused by quitting the band. It completely filters out the pressure they were under. It filters out the fact that she had her own valid reasons for leaving. She literally cannot perceive her own grace. And because her mind is trapped behind this broken lens, she requires a radical intervention. A standard therapy session isn't going to break through that level of entrenched cognitive distortion. She needs to physically, viscerally experience the alternatives to prove the distortion false. And that brings us to the mechanism of the intervention itself, the Midnight Library. At exactly midnight, after taking an overdose of pills, Nora doesn't die immediately. She wakes up in a misty, infinite library. Standing there is Mrs. Elm, her trusted school librarian from when she was a teenager. Mrs. Elm presents her with a massive, heavy, stone-grey book called the Book of Regrets, and then she explains the mechanics of this place. The shelves go on forever. Every single book is a portal to a life branching off from a different choice Nora could have made. A life where she didn't quit swimming. A life where she went to Australia with her best friend Izzy. The rules are fascinating. She can stay in any of these alternate lives for as long as she wants, provided she truly desires it. But the moment she feels profound disappointment, she is pulled right back to the library. Here's what's brilliant about this. The library isn't really about time travel. It's not a sci-fi playground. It's a controlled experiment in human desire. The library isn't asking what if. It's asking something far more unsettling. Do you actually want what you think you want? It tests the validity of her regrets by forcing her to live the consequences of the opposite choice. And we see this mechanism clearly with her very first, simplest test, the cat. She asks to go to the life where her cat Voltaire is kept indoors. Her massive, immediate regret in her root life was that she let him out, and he was hit by a car. She is carrying this crushing guilt that she killed her only companion by being careless, so she goes to the life where she kept him inside, expecting to find him curled up on the bed. She can't find him. Mrs. Elm brings her back and reveals that Voltaire still died. He had a severe, undetectable heart condition. Keeping him indoors didn't save him. It just meant he died under a bed instead of out in the open. Now, a fair critique here, isn't that a bit convenient? Magically giving the cat an undetectable heart condition to absolve Nora of the guilt. Life isn't usually that neat. Sometimes we really are the reason something bad happens. That's a completely fair observation about the plot mechanics. But consider the psychological utility of that device. In this specific moment, Nora suffers from what the research calls an illusion of omnipotent responsibility, a very common feature of depression, where you believe everything bad that happens around you is exclusively your fault, like you personally control the weather. The narrative gives the cat a heart condition, not to say nobody ever makes mistakes, but to shatter Nora's specific delusion of control. It demonstrates that some tragedies are simply tragic, regardless of our choices. It begins to chip away at her belief that she is a walking curse. It clears the board. so she can start looking at her bigger choices without that immediate, overwhelming static of guilt. And so, with the ground rules established, Nora starts jumping into the major what-ifs. Let's look at the lives that seem like absolute wins on paper. The glamorous, successful lives. She starts with the pub life. She had backed out of marrying Dan, a man who dreamed of running a rural pub in Oxfordshire. Her depression told her she ruined his life, so she chooses the life where she didn't back out. She wakes up outside a quaint pub called the Three Horseshoes. It looks idyllic, but when she goes inside, she finds Dan drinking heavily. He's bitter, he's argumentative, and it's heavily implied he's having an affair. The dream he sold her was entirely hollow, and that reveals something important. We don't just romanticize our own alternate choices, we romanticize the people we would have made those choices with. Dan wasn't a perfect guy whose life she ruined. He was a flawed guy whose flaws amplified when he got what he thought he wanted. But the really intense pivot happens when she tries the glaciologist life. In her youth, she had been fascinated by the Arctic, encouraged by Mrs. Elm. So she ends up in Svalbard, doing high-level climate research, and she steps out of her cabin and comes face to face with a polar bear. She is totally alone, terrified, banging a pan to scare this massive predator away. And in that moment of absolute primal terror, facing imminent death, she realizes something profound. She actually wants to live. The irony is staggering. A few hours prior in Bedford, she deliberately took an overdose to end her life. Her conscious mind had decided existence was unbearable. But here in Svalbard, faced with an external threat, her biological survival instinct roars to the surface. It highlights the difference between passive suicidal ideation, the feeling of wanting to stop existing because of emotional pain, and the active, primal will to survive. When the intellectual noise is stripped away by the presence of a polar bear, her body screams, "I am not done yet." The depression had anesthetized her will to live. The adrenaline burned the anesthesia away. But even after surviving the bear, she realizes she doesn't actually want the cold, isolated life of a glaciologist. It's too lonely. She needs connection. And before she leaves Svalbard, this trip introduces a massive philosophical complication. She meets Hugo. Hugo is what he calls a slider. He is in the same liminal state as Nora in his own root life, but he has been jumping between parallel universes for much longer. And Hugo uses the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics to justify his existence. For anyone who hasn't taken a physics class recently, here's how it works. Hugo relies on the concept of superposition, famously illustrated by Schrödinger's cat. In quantum mechanics, before you observe a particle, it exists in a state of superposition, meaning it is in all possible states at once. It's only the act of observation that forces the particle to commit to a single reality. This is called collapsing the wave function. Schrödinger's thought experiment applied this to a cat in a box with a radioactive trigger. Until you open the box and look, the cat is theoretically both alive and dead simultaneously. Hugo views his life as the ultimate superposition. He believes that by never staying in one timeline, by never truly committing to one life, he avoids collapsing the wave function. He gets to be everything: the successful businessman, the starving artist, the Arctic researcher. He is terrified of making a choice because every choice is the death of infinite other possibilities, so he just endlessly slides. He's seductive in his own way. He's wealthy. He's experienced everything. He treats the multiverse like a limitless playground. But here's the problem, and this is a vital point. Does endlessly sliding between lives without committing to one strip away the meaning of life altogether? If you could always just hit the reset button the moment things get hard, do your choices even matter? The book uses Hugo's ultimate fate to answer that question definitively. Hugo's version of the Midnight Library isn't a library full of books, it's a purgatorial video store. He is trapped there endlessly watching VHS tapes of his possible lives. He isn't a participant in his existence, he is merely a consumer of it. Endless possibilities without commitment equal emptiness. Meaning requires investment, and investment requires staying through the difficult parts, the boring parts, the painful parts. You cannot cultivate a meaningful life if your only mechanism is to immediately escape to another reality, which perfectly sets up her next jump. Having rejected the isolation of the Arctic, she tries the biggest, loudest win of all, the rockstar life. In her root life, quitting her band The Labyrinths was the source of her brother Joe's deep estrangement, so she chooses the life where she pushed through her panic attacks and stayed in the band. She wakes up in a massive stadium in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The crowd is roaring her name. She has 11 million Instagram followers. She is dating a famous actor named Ryan Bailey, the absolute pinnacle of worldly success. But to achieve that level of fame, Nora had to become someone she fundamentally isn't. When she's on stage and supposed to play their biggest hit, a song called How, she realizes she doesn't even know it, because she didn't write it. Instead, she sits at the piano and plays Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, a beautiful melancholic choice, but it alienates her bandmates and her audience, and then it gets much worse. When she looks for her brother Joe, expecting him to be thrilled by their shared success, she finds out he's not in the band anymore. In fact, he's dead. But before we get to that climax, we need to take a step back and look at how this narrative is perceived by outside critics. Because while many find this exploration deeply moving, not everyone thinks this book is a masterpiece of psychological insight. There is a highly critical perspective that provides a fascinating counterweight to everything we've discussed. This critique calls the book a didactic self-help manual and argues the messages have the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The critique takes issue with several core elements, primarily what is often termed the linguistic theory of depression. The idea, rooted in cognitive behavioral therapy, that the language we use to describe our experiences dictates our emotional reality. If you constantly tell yourself, "I am a failure," your brain will wire itself to believe that is an objective fact. Therefore, by changing your internal script, by reframing your thoughts, you can alter your emotional state. In clinical settings, CBT is a highly effective tool, but the criticism argues that the Midnight Library takes this to an unrealistic extreme, presenting a always look on the bright side trope that minimizes the very real chemical and systemic realities of clinical depression. The critique goes further. It objects to Mrs. Elm as a godlike, universe-ordering figure, calling the whole thing cotton candy advice, sweet, but of little nutritional value. The parallel lives in this reading exist purely to force unearned lessons on the reader, so we don't accidentally miss the message. It's a harsh critique, but it touches on a very real tension between philosophical narrative and clinical reality. The research sees the library as a brilliant psychological construct, a way to map the distorted thinking of a depressed mind. The critic sees it as a saccharine group therapy session. They argue that telling a suicidal person that things could be worse, or that disappointment with one's regrets is a cure for regrets, is not just cheesy, it's potentially dangerous toxic positivity. So is Haig's work a masterclass in dissecting the depressed mind? Or is it an unrealistic self-help brochure? It depends entirely on whether you view depression through a philosophical lens or a strictly clinical one. The book undeniably leans into philosophy, quoting Thoreau, invoking quantum mechanics, framing perception as the core problem. We aren't here to declare one side right and the other wrong, but it's vital to recognize that the very structure that makes this book a lifesaver for some readers makes it unbearable for others. And regardless of where you fall on that divide, within the internal logic of the narrative itself, Nora's realization in the Cambridge life brings her journey to a literal breaking point. She realizes she doesn't belong in the perfect Cambridge life. She feels that deep foundational disappointment in her own fraudulence. She is pulled back to the Midnight Library, but this time, something is horribly wrong. The infinite shelves are collapsing. The books are bursting into flames. The clock on Mrs. Elm's watch is ticking down from 23 seconds. Time is finally running out in her root life. The pills are taking their final toll on her physical body back in Bedford. Mrs. Elm tells Nora that the library is falling apart because Nora has fundamentally changed. She finally truly wants to live. The library was a manifestation of her liminal state, the space between life and death, built entirely of indecision. But now the indecision is gone. The construct can no longer hold her. But Mrs. Elm tells her she can't just wish herself back. She can't passively hope to survive. She has to find the one book that isn't burning, a completely blank book. She has to actively write her choice in it. As the ceiling literally collapses around her, she finds the book, grabs a cheap plastic school pen, and writes the only thing that matters: I am alive. It's such a visceral moment, because the desire to live isn't something someone can hand to you. You can't be gifted the will to survive by a spouse, or a perfectly curated Cambridge lifestyle, or a million Instagram followers. It's something you have to find for yourself, internally. And sometimes you can only find it by running out of every other alternative. The pressure of fame, combined with a toxic environment and access to drugs, led him to a fatal overdose years prior. She got the fame, but she lost her brother completely. And this is where we hit what is arguably the most profound insight of this entire story: the concept that regret is a category error. A category error in philosophy is when you assign a quality to a thing that can't possibly possess that quality, like saying a rock is sad, or a number is green. When Nora regrets not staying in the band, she is treating her life like a spreadsheet. She thinks she can open the file, change one cell, swap quit band for stay in band, and the math will update. But every other cell will remain identical. She assumes she'll have the fame, and Joe will still be the happy, healthy brother he was at 22. But life doesn't work that way. It's not a spreadsheet, it's an ecosystem. When you introduce a new predator into a forest, you don't just get a forest with one extra animal, you change the entire food web. Every choice creates a completely new web of consequences. You can't swap out one decision and magically avoid all the pain associated with it. In the rockstar life, she gets the money and the fame, but the environment that created that fame also created the conditions for Joe's death. In the glaciologist life, she gets the Arctic adventure, but she is utterly isolated. The fantasy of the perfect choice, where you get all the benefits of a decision with none of the unforeseen downstream friction, is just that, a fantasy. So, having exhausted all these loud, glamorous wins and found them entirely hollow, Nora returns to the library. Fame, adventure, fulfilling other people's dreams. None of it cured her despair. And here's where the story shifts. She is drawn to something quieter, something far more seductive precisely because of its simplicity. Up until now, Nora has been chasing huge, sweeping ambitions, but now she looks for something smaller. She remembers a man named Ash, a surgeon who used to come into the music shop in Bedford. He had asked her out for coffee once, but she said no, because she was engaged to Dan. She asks Mrs. Elm for the life where she said yes to that single cup of coffee. And this life is dangerously perfect. She wakes up in a beautiful sunlit house in Cambridge. She's married to Ash. They have an adorable daughter named Molly and a dog named Plato. Ash is kind, supportive. He cooks for her. He loves her deeply. She's even writing a book about her favorite philosopher, Henry David Thoreau. Everything is warm and safe and intellectually fulfilling. This is the most dangerous trap in the library. Because it is so deeply seductive, she stays in this timeline for weeks. She really truly almost chooses to stay forever. She learns to fake her way through the memories she doesn't have. She watches Ash and Molly and thinks, maybe this is it. Maybe settling into this prefabricated happiness is the answer. But then the localized butterfly effect kicks in and it reveals a much darker truth. Because she never lived in Bedford in this timeline, the small ripples of her presence there are gone. She takes a trip back to Bedford and finds out that her former piano student Leo, the one she felt she was failing in her root life by missing a lesson, has been arrested for stealing. Without her cheap, patient piano lessons giving him a safe haven, he fell in with a bad crowd, and her elderly neighbor, Mr. Banerjee. In her root life, she felt useless to him. But she had helped him set up his online groceries and picked up his medication, which allowed him to maintain his independence. In this Cambridge timeline, without those small daily interventions, his health declined rapidly and he was forced into a care home against his will. It completely flips the script on her suicide note, the one where she claims she made life worse for people. She actually functioned as a load-bearing pillar in the lives of these vulnerable people, and she couldn't see it because her depression blinded her to her own utility. And there's another layer to this Cambridge life that forces her out. As she stays, she starts to lose her original self. The memories of her root life, the struggles, the pain, the very things that make her her, start to fade. She's dissolving into this alternate Nora, and she comes to a crushing realization. She didn't earn this life. She just parachuted into the finish line. It's like moving into a beautifully furnished house that someone else built. There are family photos on the wall of vacations you didn't go on. There are inside jokes you don't actually understand. You can tell yourself you decorated it and lived those memories, but deep down you know you are a squatter. The deep, abiding love Ash has is for the Nora who lived those years of building a life with him, not the Nora who just arrived from a suicide attempt in a dilapidated flat in Bedford. Nora had to exhaust the multiverse. She had to see that fame was a hollow trap that killed her brother, that running away to the ice left her cold and terrified, and that even the perfect domestic life was a lie if she hadn't earned the scars to appreciate it. Waking up in her root life, she is immediately vomiting up the pills. She drags herself across the floor to Mr. Banerjee's door, collapses on his mat, and he calls an ambulance. She saves herself by reaching out to the very neighbor she thought she was useless to. And the beautiful grounded thing about this ending is that when she recovers, she doesn't magically have a perfect life. Bedford is still Bedford. She doesn't wake up with $1 million or a sudden record deal. The objective facts of her life are identical. She's still 35. She's still single. She still doesn't have a glamorous career, and she still has to figure out how to pay her rent. But she is different. She reunites with her brother Joe at the hospital. The estrangement begins to thaw. And in a brilliant little nod to her multiverse travels, she advises him to ask out a doctor named Ewan Langford, because she knows from the rockstar timeline that he becomes Joe's future husband. And she saves Mr. Banerjee from going into the care home simply by committing to staying in his life. Which brings us back to the Thoreau quote Nora had tattooed on her arm in the rockstar life. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. The objective facts of Nora's life haven't changed, but her lens has healed. She is no longer looking through the autoimmune disease of depression that told her she was a burden. She sees the immense, undeniable value in her small, seemingly insignificant interactions. She sees that giving cheap piano lessons to a struggling kid isn't a failure of her potential. It's a profound act of community building. She understands now that her root life, with all its messiness, its flaws, and its pain, is the only one that truly belongs to her. The only place where she can create authentic meaning, because it is the only place where her choices have real stakes. So let's recap this journey. We started with a sci-fi premise, a library of alternate realities, and peeled it back to reveal a profound exploration of a mind at war with itself. We learned that regret is a category error. You can't change one piece of your past, one cell in the spreadsheet, without altering the entire ecosystem of your present. And we saw that depression isn't just a heavy mood. It's a cognitive lens that actively distorts reality, making you blind to the good you actually do. It's a testament to the idea that meaning isn't found in a flawless alternate reality where you never make a mistake. It's found in the messy, imperfect life you are actually living right now. So here is the final thought I want to leave you with. Think about your own book of regrets. We all have one. Heavy, stone grey, sitting on a shelf somewhere in the back of our minds. But what would happen if you stopped looking at those regrets as proof that your life is fundamentally wrong? What if, starting today, you viewed those missteps, those failed relationships, those closed doors, as the necessary complex ecosystem that keeps you uniquely yourself? Thanks for listening. We hope exploring these concepts gave you a new perspective on the mechanics of your own choices. Keep questioning the lens through which you view your life, because it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. Until next time.